It wasn't something that happened every day, not even once a week or once a month. It didn't have any specific hour, it was just happening sometimes. Today in the afternoon I was in my house and suddenly I heard it. At the beginning I couldn't distinguish well what it was. For a while it sounded like an engine sound. It was strange because it didn't have any fixed source. It was like an echo that was going through all the windows of the house, and although it was soft, it sounded like a background noise that was intermingled with the voice in the TV news and with the bubbling sound of the boiling water in the kitchen. In the past, I had heard similar sounds which were mixing with those of my house without knowing exactly where they came from. It was more common during the weekends, when from somewhere far away or maybe close by, someone using a sound system was shouting the names of missing people and asking for help to find them. The descriptions of those people were always unclear and incomplete. I suppose it was due to the distortion that the voice in the microphone suffered by the wind and the distance. Sometimes the voice was still in the air until the morning after if the missing person hadn't been found during the night. Once I was on my bed trying to fall asleep when I heard someone crying. I don't know how, but it seemed that the moans were coming from very close, maybe from right outside my house. It was very late in the night and I found it unusual. The weeping sometimes varied its intensity. Sometimes it was loud, some other slow and tenuous. But the silent moments weren't calmed at all, and despite the absence of the sound, still some sort of tension was perceived, as if the crying didn't stop and the silent pauses were making the next sob stronger. Since my room is on the first floor, I went through the door of the balcony that faces the street, so I could see who was crying and maybe help him, but once I was outside, I realized that the sound wasn't coming from any specific place. That crying was something like an echo that was coming from everywhere. After a while, the sound of the engine changed and turned into a voice which was saying the same sentences as a looping sequence. I imagine if electronic beat was added to the voice, it could have sounded as Farley Farley by Farley Jackmaster Funk. Farley, Farley, Farley Farley, Farley Farley, 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 Farley Farley, Farley Farley, 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 Farley Farley, Farley Farley. But in this case, the loops were not as innocent as the ones used in 90s house music. This voice that was constantly moving around wasn't mentioning anything specific. Everything was ambiguous and open, but still, it was speaking about crime, about murders of ordinary people, about commonplaces. They caught the criminals. They were from this neighborhood. Rapists, assailants, kidnappers. Here are the pictures. Rapists, assailants, kidnappers. Here are the pictures. They caught the criminals. They were from this neighborhood. Here are the pictures. They caught the criminals. Here are the pictures. They were from this neighborhood. Here are the pictures. When the voice was louder and closer to my house, it suddenly stopped, and the only audible noises from outside were the shouts and kicks made by some young people and children playing soccer not so far away. Sometimes they were celebrating after scoring. Some others, they were insulting each other and saying their names and nicknames. The voice on the TV news was very weak compared to the sounds coming from outside. At one point, I wanted to turn off the volume, but I realized that I wasn't really interested on what the voice was saying, the trending topics, the world's political situation, the sports highlights. Only the voice of the news and its fake company feeling mattered at the moment when my thoughts were speculating about the result of the street match that was happening outside, with all those people that I was seeing so often but were so unknown and distant at the same time. I once read in a book a phrase that I found very intriguing, which was in a short story about immortality. Not the immortality of vampires or any other fantastic being who is unable to die. It was about the immortality given by the repetition of the life cycles and the routine, the way how people live and survive. The faces are not born until we see them, thought the character in the short story, surprised by having found a child whose childhood was identical to his, and how such coincidence would inevitably end up in the repetition of a monotonous and predictable life and death. It is very difficult to know what lies behind the faces and what they contain, their stories, their secrets, and their similarities with other ones. Once I was walking through a street market. It was almost dark and most of the merchants were already packing their products. I stopped to look at an improvised vending place in which old magazines and documents were sold. At the beginning, I was distracted by looking at old magazines from the 60s, but soon I realized that there was a mountain of old photographs on the opposite corner of the place. I began to see them one by one. There were landscapes, portraits, group photos. Some were large and some others small. While I was distracted separating the most interesting ones, the vendor asked me if I was very interested on them, so he could give me a good price for all the stack because it was a bit late and he wanted to go home. After a brief haggling, I bought all of the images for very little money. I never knew why I bought them or what use I was going to give them. I was only intrigued by the barrier that existed between us, and their contained stories that it was not even important to know. For a long time the photos were left in a plastic bag and moving around my house until the day they got wet by the rain. Some images were lost, some others only changed. The voice in the speaker started again. This time it was preceded by the sound of an engine starting. As it grew more intense, the sentences that were previously ambiguous and open were now specific, and they were mentioning names and addresses. I could perceive certain agitation from the outside, when the voice in the speaker was clearly selling a newspaper, when the doors of the neighbors were opening and closing, analogical voices mixing with the distorted one from the speaker that excitedly was repeating the names and nicknames at minutes later, and when the car which was selling the news had gone far enough, I realized belonged to the soccer players whose voices were erased by the one from the speaker. Then I turned off the television.